Ethan Walker was still smiling when he sealed the last envelope. It was a small, deliberate smile, the kind that has nothing to do with joy and everything to do with the quiet thrill of anticipated cruelty. He pressed his thumb along the edge of the cream-colored flap, feeling the expensive weight of the cardstock beneath his fingers, savoring the moment the way a man savors the final move in a game he believes he has already won. The wedding invitation was addressed, in his own handwriting, to Vanessa Brooks, the woman he had once called his wife, the woman he had since reduced, in his memory and in the stories he told at dinner parties, to nothing more than a footnote in his assent. He handed it to his assistant without a word, and his assistant, who had learned long ago not to ask questions, carried it away without one. That evening, Ethan sat with three of his closest friends at a rooftop bar overlooking the city, and when he mentioned the invitation, the table erupted in laughter. One of them, a ruddy-faced developer named Clark, who wore his wealth in the looseness of his posture, leaned back in his chair and shook his head with theatrical disbelief. "She won't come," Clark said. "Women like that never come. They know better." Another friend, Marcus, swirled his drink and offered a different theory. "Or maybe she's still working tables somewhere. Probably can't afford the dress." The laughter rolled around the table again, easy and self-congratulatory, the laughter of men who have never had to examine themselves too closely because the world has always affirmed them before they could ask the question. Ethan said nothing. He only smiled, the same small, deliberate smile, and lifted his glass. He had not invited Vanessa out of sentiment. There was no residual warmth in the gesture, no tremor of guilt softened into gesture. He had invited her because he wanted her to see it. The chandelier-lit hotel ballroom, the five-course dinner, the bride who was 12 years younger and 10 times more photogenic, the table of investors and city councilmen and old-money families who now called Ethan Walker a peer. He wanted Vanessa to stand in that room and understand, with her whole body, what she had lost. Or rather, and this was the part he never examined too closely, what she had never deserved. He had carried that belief for 2 years, polished it like a stone in his pocket, and the wedding had given him the perfect stage on which to present it. What Ethan did not consider, because men like Ethan rarely consider the inner lives of the people they have discarded, was what Vanessa's life had actually become. He pictured her the way he had last seen her, quiet, dry-eyed, signing papers at a lawyer's table with the particular stillness of a person swallowing something they refused to name. He had taken that stillness as defeat. It had not occurred to him that it might be the composure of someone who had already decided in that moment exactly who she intended to become. When the envelope arrived at the address his assistant had dug up from old records, Vanessa Brooks was standing in her penthouse kitchen, barefoot, reviewing a contract. She read the invitation once, set it down on the marble counter, and stood looking at it for a long moment. The city hummed 31 floors below her. One of her team leads was waiting for her on a call, and she had a meeting with a defense contractor in the morning, and there were approximately 47 things more pressing than this cream-colored piece of cardstock, with its gold leaf lettering, and its invitation to witness the happiness of a man who had once asked her to be smaller, so he could feel larger. She picked it up and read it again. Then she said very quietly, to no one in particular, "He actually wants me there." She set the card down and walked to the window and looked at the city for a while longer. Then, she opened the drawer of the console table near the entryway, and from beneath a folded document and a spare set of keys, she withdrew a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside, the diamond of her former wedding ring caught the light without warmth, the way old things do. She looked at it for only a moment before closing the box again. Then she picked up her phone and made a call, and when the line connected, she said simply, "Clear my Saturday." The marriage had lasted 6 years, and for most of those 6 years, it had been Vanessa holding the structure upright with both hands. She had not resented it, not at first, and not even in the middle, when the weight became undeniable. She had loved Ethan with the particular devotion of a person who believes, genuinely and without cynicism, that the people we love are capable of becoming their best selves if only we provide the right conditions. She had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. She had worked 2 jobs while he launched and shuttered 3 separate ventures, each failure leaving him a little more brittle, a little more in need of her steady voice at the end of the day. She had sold her car, a decision that cost her 2 hours of commuting time every day for 8 months to fund his 4th attempt, a commercial real estate consulting firm that had promise but needed capital, and, more than capital, needed the kind of introductions that only came from knowing the right people in the right rooms. Vanessa knew those people. She had spent years building relationships quietly, without fanfare, in the way that people who are not given credit for their intelligence learn to operate efficiently, invisibly, with long-term patience. She made calls she never mentioned. She arranged meetings she attributed to luck or to Ethan's own initiative. She smoothed over the rough edges of his personality in conversations he was not present for, because she understood that his ambition was real, even when his execution was clumsy, and she believed the ambition deserved a chance. The thrum of watching him finally succeed, watching the deal close, watching his shoulders lose that particular tightness they carried when he felt like a failure, had been its own reward. She had not needed the credit. She had needed him to become who she believed he could be. She remembered the night the first major deal had closed, a commercial development contract worth more than anything either of them had dared to name during the lean years. Ethan had called her from the client's office, his voice cracked with something she had never heard in it before, a high, disbelieving quality, like a man who has been holding his breath so long he has forgotten what air tastes like. She had sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs had simply given way with relief, and she had cried for nearly 10 minutes, quietly, with the phone pressed to her ear. And he had not noticed because he was already talking about next steps, about expansion, about the name they were going to make. She had not told him she was crying. She had wiped her face and listened and said the right things. And when she hung up, she had sat on the floor a while longer, feeling the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for so long that the absence of it is itself disorienting. She had believed in that moment that the difficult part was over. She had been wrong about what the difficult part would turn out to be. What she had not anticipated was that becoming who he believed he could be would require him to stop seeing her at all. The change was not sudden, which made it more difficult to name. It was gradual, the way erosion is gradual, each small recession barely noticeable, until the day you look and find that the landscape has entirely changed. He began attending events without her, citing the impracticality of schedules. He began introducing her at the events she did attend with a flatness in his voice that bordered on apology, not for her, but for himself, for the inconvenience of a wife who wore natural hair and worked a shift that ended at 9 and did not move through the rooms of the wealthy with the instinctive fluency he was rapidly acquiring. He told her, one evening over a dinner that had grown cold because he arrived late without calling, that she was too comfortable with being ordinary. She had looked at him across the table for a long time before responding. She had said, "There will come a day when you understand what loyalty is worth." He had not answered. 2 weeks later, she found the text messages from Sophia. The divorce had been cold and swift, executed with the efficiency of a man who had decided to treat the dissolution of a 6-year partnership the way he treated a bad quarterly report. Something to process, move past, and never revisit. His friends had circled him like a validation wall, assuring him that he had outgrown the relationship, that Vanessa had been a chapter and chapters had to end. Vanessa had sat across from the lawyers and signed everything without tears, without dramatics, without the broken woman performance that Ethan had, she suspected, half expected and half wanted. She had asked for nothing beyond what was fair. As she left the building, she had paused on the steps for just a moment, not from grief, but from the peculiar clarity that arrives at endings. And she had understood, with a certainty that settled in her chest like ballast, exactly what she was going to do next. Ethan heard that Vanessa had confirmed the invitation through the same assistant network that had delivered the card, and the information pleased him in a way that felt almost physical. He told Sophia about it that night casually, as though it were of no consequence, and watched her face arrange itself into the expression she wore when something bothered her and she didn't want him to know. "Why would she come?" Sophia asked, adjusting the strap of her dress in the mirror without turning around. "That's what I want to see," Ethan said. He could feel his own excitement like a low current, something he wouldn't have admitted to, even under pressure. He wanted an audience for his triumph, and Vanessa's presence would be the sharpest possible framing device. Before and after, lesser and greater, then and now. He had no doubt she would arrive humbled, perhaps even visibly diminished by time and circumstance. and he intended to receive her with the particular magnanimity of a man so thoroughly victorious that he can afford to be gracious. What he was constructing in his mind bore no resemblance to the woman who was, at that precise moment, reviewing security protocols in a glass-walled conference room while 4 former Special Operations soldiers waited for her to conclude a briefing. Vanessa had built Brooke's strategic security in the 2 years since the divorce, with the same methodology she had always applied to everything, systematically, without ego, by identifying what was needed and providing it before the market fully understood that it needed it. She had started with one contract, corporate protection, for a pharmaceutical executive who had received credible threats and couldn't trust his own staff, and she had delivered with such precision that the referrals had come without her asking. By the end of the first year, she had 15 active clients. By the end of the second, she had 32, a staff of 21, 2 satellite offices, and a reputation in the private security industry that had reached the kind of people who did not use the word impressive lightly. She was not famous. She did not seek visibility. But in the specific world of high net worth protection and corporate risk management, the name Vanessa Brooks carried the particular gravity of someone who had never failed a client. The men and women who worked for her, most of them with military or federal law enforcement backgrounds, people who had spent careers in environments where failure had irreversible consequences, had not expected to work for someone like her. Not because she was a woman, though the industry had its biases, and she had navigated them with the strategic patience she applied to everything, but because she was someone who had built a security company without ever having been in the field herself. What they discovered quickly, and what earned their genuine respect, rather than the contractual variety, was that she understood threat assessment, the way that people understand things when they have learned through necessity rather than training. From the inside, viscerally, with a precision that came from having spent years reading situations and people in real time because the cost of misreading was real. She had spent 6 years married to a man whose emotional landscape shifted without warning, and in those years she had developed an attunement to subtlety that translated, with surprising directness, into risk evaluation. She saw what people were trying to hide before they fully understood they were hiding it. It was not a gift. It was a skill built from survival, and she had found it an unexpected legacy of a marriage she had otherwise resolved to leave behind entirely. Marcus, her head of operations, appeared in the doorway of her penthouse, the afternoon before the wedding, with the folder she had requested. He set it on the table and looked at her with the careful expression of a man who respects his employer enough to say what needs saying. "You sure you want to attend this?" he said. She picked up the folder without opening it. "I'm not going to create a scene," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm worried about." She looked at him. "Then what are you worried about?" He considered the question. "I'm worried about what it costs you to be in a room with someone who never understood your value." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not going to that room for him. I'm going to close something. There's a difference." Marcus nodded slowly. Then he set the folder on the table. "Everything we found is in there," he said. "Read it tonight." The Grand Harrington Hotel had been selected for the wedding with the specific intention of making an impression, and it succeeded on those terms without qualification. The ballroom ceiling soared 40 feet above hand-laid marble floors, and the floral arrangements, cream roses and trailing ivy, ordered from a florist who served 3 embassies, and a governor cost more than most people's monthly rent. Ethan moved through the cocktail hour with the loose, expansive energy of a man performing prosperity for an audience he had specifically curated. He was dressed in a custom suit, his watch ostentatiously visible at the cuff, his smile calibrated for maximum approachability without sacrificing an ounce of dominance. He shook hands, received compliments, and allowed himself to be photographed with the easy fluency of someone who had practiced this version of himself until it felt like the original. Sophia stood beside him in an ivory dress that fit her like the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and she was beautiful in the way that photographs are beautiful, complete from the outside, difficult to read from within. She smiled at the right moments and held Ethan's arm with the right pressure, but her eyes moved through the room with a restlessness she couldn't fully suppress. She had been asking about Vanessa for 2 weeks, in the tonal register of someone who claimed not to care but kept returning to the subject. Ethan had dismissed her each time, but the dismissals had a quality to them, slightly too quick, slightly too certain, that had not escaped her. She had once asked, during a quieter evening, why he had invited his ex-wife at all, and he had given her an answer that sounded reasonable on the surface, but had an odd hollow at the center of it, like a wall that rings wrong when you knock. She had not pushed. She was learning, without wanting to, that there were rooms inside Ethan she was not invited into. Outside the hotel, at precisely 7:43 in the evening, a formation of 3 black SUVs pulled to the curb with the deliberate spacing of a motorcade. The valets near the entrance paused. A doorman stepped back without being asked. The first vehicle's door opened, and a man in a charcoal suit, broad-shouldered, unhurried, scanning the entrance with the practiced calm of someone trained for exactly this, stepped out and took position. 2 more followed from the second vehicle. They did not rush. They did not perform. They simply occupied space with the quiet authority of people who know what they are protecting. And then the third door opened, and Vanessa Brooks stepped out. She wore black, not the apologetic black of a woman trying to disappear, but the deliberate black of a woman who has no interest in competing for a room's attention and therefore commands it completely. The cut of the dress was architectural, precise, the kind of garment that requires a specific relationship with one's own body to wear correctly, and she wore it correctly. She paused for exactly 1 beat at the base of the steps, not for drama, but because one of her security team was confirming the interior layout through an earpiece, and in that beat, 3 different people standing near the entrance turned to look at her and forgot to turn away. She walked into the Grand Harrington with the evenness of a woman who has nowhere to hurry to, because she has already arrived, in every sense that matters, well before tonight. The doorman who had worked the entrance of the Grand Harrington for 11 years, and had seen the arrival of governors and film stars and a foreign head of state, watched Vanessa Brooks cross the lobby threshold and felt, without being able to explain it afterward, that something had just changed in the room. It was not the security team, though they were conspicuous. It was something in the quality of her attention, the way her eyes moved through the space, with the efficiency of someone cataloging, rather than admiring, taking in the room not as a spectacle, but as a set of variables she was already processing. She paused briefly near the entrance to the ballroom corridor, while one of her team murmured something through an earpiece, and in that pause she was entirely still, which was itself its own kind of theater, in a room full of people performing enjoyment. Then she nodded once and walked in, but it was real. Spreading through the crowd, the way temperature changes spread gradually, and then all at once. The first people to notice were near the entrance. The whisper moved inward. Ethan, who was mid-sentence with a city councilman near the bar, registered the change in the room's attention before he located its source, and something in him went still, in a way that had nothing to do with composure. He turned. He saw the security team, first 3 men in charcoal suits, moving with professional precision through the edges of the room, and then he saw Vanessa, making her way toward an open table with the kind of ease that comes from having nothing to prove. He had expected many things. The version of Vanessa he had spent 2 years constructing in his memory, diminished, perhaps brittle. Certainly less was nowhere in this room. The woman crossing his ballroom floor looked like someone who had taken the last 2 years and built an entire world inside them. He gripped his glass a little tighter and said nothing. Sophia was the one who spoke first, leaning into his shoulder and saying quietly, with a control that barely covered the edge beneath it, "Why does she have bodyguards?" Ethan's jaw moved. "She's just making an entrance," he said. "It doesn't mean anything." Across the room, a man in his 60s, Raymond Holt, a venture capitalist whose name appeared on the boards of 4 publicly traded companies, stopped mid-conversation and stared at Vanessa with an expression of undisguised recognition. He said something to the person beside him. The other man turned to look. Both of them began moving through the crowd toward her. Another guest, a woman in a green dress who worked in corporate finance, touched her companion's arm and said, "Is that the Brooks Security CEO? I heard she handled the Meridian situation." Her companion did not know, but within the next 10 minutes, the information was circulating through the room's more attentive quarters, with the quiet efficiency of real news in a room full of people who trade in it. Ethan intercepted Raymond Holt near the edge of the dance floor, placing himself in the older man's path, with the smoothness of practice. "Raymond," he said, extending a hand. Raymond took it, but his attention was visibly divided. "Ethan," he said. "That woman, the one who came in just now, with a security team. He paused. Is that Vanessa Brooks? Of Brooks Strategic? Ethan's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. My ex-wife. Yes, he said, with the tone of a man dismissing a minor footnote. Raymond Holt looked at him with an expression that contained something Ethan could not immediately classify. It was not pity exactly, but it was adjacent to it. Son, Raymond said, and his voice was level, not unkind. Do you have any idea who that woman has become? The question hung in the air between them for a moment before Ethan redirected the conversation toward a prospective deal, and Raymond let him, but the older man's eyes moved back to Vanessa twice more before they parted. Ethan returned to Sophia's side and refreshed his drink and smiled at someone across the room, and the performance was good enough that only someone who knew him well would have noticed that the ease had gone out of it, replaced by something that required more effort to maintain. Sophia noticed. She said nothing. She was beginning to understand that there were things being revealed tonight that she had not been given the information to prepare for. Vanessa sat with Raymond Holt for nearly 20 minutes, and their conversation had the quality of two people who share a common language of competence, efficient, interested, without pretension. Raymond had been an early client, back when Brooks Strategic was barely 6 months old, and Vanessa had taken the meeting in a borrowed conference room. He had given her his first major contract, not out of charity, but because her assessment of his security vulnerabilities had been so precise and so immediate that he had understood he was in the presence of someone who saw things others missed. 2 years later, he was still a client, and he sat beside her at Ethan Walker's wedding, watching the man attempt to hold his room together, and feeling, with the particular melancholy of experience, that he was watching something wind down without knowing it. What Raymond knew, what he had pieced together, from both professional proximity to Vanessa and a long memory for business genealogy, was the kind of detail that tends to get buried in the mythology of self-made success. He remembered the meeting, years ago, between Ethan Walker's fledgling consulting firm and a consortium of developers who had no particular reason to take the meeting. He had been in the room, a peripheral presence, when the introduction was made. The introduction had come through channels he had later traced back, quietly, to Vanessa. She had called in a favor from someone who owed her one, and she had done it without alerting Ethan, because she understood, and this was the part that had stayed with Raymond, the part that spoke to the particular quality of her intelligence, that Ethan's pride would not survive, knowing he needed the help. So she had given him the help invisibly, and he had taken the credit visibly, and she had said nothing because the success of the firm had mattered more to her than the attribution. Raymond had never told Ethan. He had assumed Ethan knew. It was only tonight, watching the man's face as he processed the reality of who his ex-wife had become, that Raymond understood Ethan had never known at all. He considered, briefly, whether to say anything. Then he thought of the invitation, the deliberate cruelty of it, the amateur theater of bringing a discarded woman to bear witness to her replacement, and he decided that some things, when they surface, should be allowed to surface completely. He had spent 40 years in rooms full of people who rewrote their own histories, and he had learned to distinguish between the kind of revision that is ordinary self-preservation and the kind that constitutes a deeper fraud against others, but more consequentially, against oneself. Ethan Walker had spent 2 years living inside a story in which he was the self-made man, the architect of his own ascent, the person who had left behind what no longer served him. Raymond had watched that story being performed tonight with the competence of long practice, and it had moved him not to admiration, but to a tired, quiet sadness for the waste of it. Because the real story, the one Vanessa had declined to narrate, the one she had simply lived, was so much more interesting, and Ethan would never know it unless someone made him look directly at it. Raymond Holt was old enough to know that making people look at things was rarely welcome and almost always necessary. Meanwhile, in a small corridor near the ballroom's service entrance, one of Ethan's financial partners, a man named Gregory Fenn, who had come to the wedding in good faith and was now deeply regretting it, had received a notification on his phone that sent a cold feeling through his chest. He had been monitoring a due diligence report on Ethan's current portfolio for several weeks, and the numbers had not been resolving in comfortable directions. He had told himself the wedding was not the place to address it, but the notification he had just received was from a source he trusted, and what it said in the dry, precise language of financial forensics was that Ethan Walker's primary holding company was carrying a debt load that had not been disclosed to any of his current partners. Gregory put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the room around him. He thought of the chandelier, the flowers, the custom suit, the conspicuous watch. He made a decision and went to find Raymond Holt. Sophia found out about the debt at 9:47 in the evening, in the way that people find out things they have been carefully steered away from by accident, and all at once, with no buffer of preparation. She had stepped into the corridor for air and had overheard, through a partially open door, the tail end of a conversation between Gregory Fenn and another man whose name she did not know. The words she caught were specific enough that no amount of context would have softened them. Undisclosed liabilities, concealment, structural insolvency. She stood very still in the corridor for a moment. Then she walked back into the ballroom. She looked at Ethan across the room at the watch, and the suit, and the laugh he deployed like currency, and she felt, with sudden and total clarity, the specific sensation of a floor dropping away beneath her. Inside the ballroom, Vanessa was not doing anything dramatic. She was conversing, eating, existing in the room, with a quiet sufficiency that required no maintenance. She asked thoughtful questions of the people near her. She listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. She did not look at Ethan with triumph or with hunger or with any of the emotions that would have confirmed the narrative he had written about her. She looked at him. On the 2 or 3 occasions, their eyes met across the room, with something closer to acknowledgement the way you look at a chapter of your life that you understand completely and have already read. This was, in ways that Ethan was struggling to articulate even to himself, more destabilizing than anything she could have done with confrontation. He had rehearsed responses to confrontation. He had prepared remarks, even casual, devastating ones for the moment when she approached him with whatever emotion she had come to express. He had not prepared for her to simply be, in his room, unmistakably herself, complete and sufficient, and apparently unburdened by a single feeling she had not chosen to carry. He drank too much. It happened gradually, and then with commitment, the way most things do when a man cannot tolerate the pressure of sobriety in a moment that requires more of him than he is prepared to give. By 10:30, the edges of Ethan's calculated ease had blurred into something raw and less disciplined, and the people closest to him could feel the shift even if they could not name it. He crossed the room with the momentum of someone who has convinced himself that what he is about to do is his idea, and he stopped in front of Vanessa's table and looked down at her with the smile of a man who believes he is still, at this moment, in control of anything. "I'm glad you came," he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "It means a lot, knowing you're here to see this." The words were crafted for an audience, and they landed with the register of a performance, the slight overpronunciation, the tilt toward cruelty dressed in the syntax of graciousness. The tables near them had gone quiet. Vanessa looked up at him with an expression so composed it bordered on kindness, and she said, clearly, and without hurry, "I didn't come for you, Ethan." The room held its breath. Ethan's smile stayed on his face one full beat past the point where it was believable, and then it shifted into something harder and less legible. Before he could respond, Raymond Holt stood from his chair with the deliberate gravity of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it through. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply said, with the flat authority of someone accustomed to having facts matter, "I think it's time to address some things that are overdue." He looked at Gregory Fenn, who had appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd. Gregory gave a short nod. What followed was not a scene in the theatrical sense. There was no shouting, no broken glass, no moment of operatic collapse. What happened was quieter and more absolute. Gregory Fenn stood and stated, in the measured language of a man who has decided that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of clarity, that he was withdrawing from the joint development project with Ethan's firm pending a full audit of the disclosed financials. He said it to Raymond technically, but the room heard it. Another partner, a woman named Diane, who had invested quietly in 2 of Ethan's residential projects, looked at her phone, and then at Gregory, and then at no one in particular, and then she rose from her table and excused herself. Sophia walked past Ethan without looking at him. She said, as she passed, one sentence, very quietly, that was not meant for anyone but him. "You should have told me." She did not stop. She did not turn back. The sound of her footsteps across the marble floor was the loudest thing in the room. For the moment it lasted, And then the sound faded, and the room filled in again with the hushed, careful noise of people who are witnessing something they will discuss for years and are already editing their proximity to it. Someone near the bar set down a glass with a small, careful sound. A waiter paused in the doorway with a tray of untouched champagne flutes, assessed the room with the veteran's instinct for changed weather, and withdrew without entering. The band, which had been playing at a tasteful volume near the dance floor, went quiet between songs and did not start again. The chandelier continued to throw its light over everything indiscriminately, as chandeliers do, illuminating without judgment the collapsed flowers and the empty chairs and the man standing alone with a glass in a room that had turned away from him. Ethan stood alone in the center of the room with the remainder of his drink in his hand and the wreckage of a very specific fantasy spread across the floor around him. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 2 years building a story about himself and has just watched the primary witness to its falseness walk through the door alive and entirely undestroyed. He said, "You did this." His voice had lost the performance. What remained was smaller and more honest, which made it worse. Vanessa looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "This was already done. I just showed up." The guests dispersed with the efficient grace of people who understand when an evening is over. The catering staff moved quietly through the thinning room, clearing glasses, restoring order to the surfaces. The chandelier above the empty dance floor cast its light over arrangements of cream roses that would be thrown away in the morning, over chairs pushed back at angles that told the story of sudden departures, over a room that had been designed for celebration and had hosted instead a kind of reckoning. Ethan sat down in the chair that had been reserved for him at the head table, and he sat there as the room emptied, and he did not move. He did not hear Vanessa approach. He was not aware of her until she was standing near him, not beside him, at a respectful distance that communicated no warmth, but also no cruelty. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they once loved and can no longer reach. The altered centerpiece was in his direct line of sight. The listing roses, the fallen petals, and she understood instinctively that he had been looking at it rather than at the room, rather than at the doors through which everyone had gone. He was not a man who sat alone well. She had known this about him years ago, and had made it, without thinking, part of how she understood her role in his life, as the person who prevented him from the particular emptiness of his own unstructured company. That understanding now seemed to her less like love, and more like a kind of enabling she had been too close to recognize. He did not speak for a moment, and when he did, the voice that came out was stripped of everything he had spent years constructing. "Did you ever really love me?" he asked. It was not the question he had planned. He had not planned anything for this moment because he had not believed this moment would exist. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I did." She did not say it to comfort him. She said it because it was true, and she had always been more interested in truth than in mercy, though people often confused the two. He looked at the table in front of him. "I knew what you were worth," he said. "I knew. I just couldn't." He stopped. She waited. She had become, over the course of 2 years, very patient with incompleteness, with the things people began and could not finish, with the spaces in sentences where the honest word should have been but wasn't. She no longer felt compelled to fill those spaces. She let this one remain. He looked up at her, and his face had in it, for the first time that evening, something true. "Did you hate me?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "I learned not to rescue people who are committed to falling." He looked at her for a long time after that, with an expression that was not anger and not pleading, but something older and more internal. The expression of a man who is, perhaps for the first time, attempting to see himself as he actually is, rather than as he has required himself to be seen. Then he looked away. "I had no idea," he said, and it was not entirely clear what he had no idea about the security company, the thwarted business deal, the 2 years, himself. She suspected he meant all of it. "I know," she said. It was the kindest thing she said to him all evening, and it was not kind. She picked up her clutch from the table where she had set it hours ago, and she looked at the room one final time, the collapsed flowers, the empty chairs, the remnants of an evening that had been designed to diminish her and had accomplished the precise opposite, and something in her chest released. Not vindication, because she had not come for that. Something quieter. The particular exhale of a person who has carried an old weight long enough to know exactly when to set it down. She turned and walked toward the exit, and behind her she heard him say her name once, the way you say the name of something after it is already gone, not to call it back, but because the saying of it is the last thing left. She did not turn around. The SUVs were waiting at the curb with their engines running, and Marcus was standing by the rear door of the center vehicle with his hands clasped in front of him, reading nothing in the situation because he was too good at his job to show anything in public. Vanessa stepped outside, and the night air came at her cool and clean, and she stood on the steps for one breath before descending. Marcus opened the door. She got in. The door closed. The vehicles pulled away from the Grand Harrington with the same unhurried formation they had arrived in, and within 90 seconds the curb was empty. In the SUV, the silence was comfortable, in the way of people who have worked alongside each other long enough to communicate without filling space. The city moved past the tinted windows, in the way it always did at this hour, the late restaurants still lit, the last bars spilling brief noise into the street as they passed, the traffic thinning toward the particular spaciousness that belongs only to the hours before midnight, when the city's pace drops to something almost human. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror once. She was looking out the window at the city passing by, her expression unreadable from the outside, but entirely legible to anyone who understood what composure costs and what it protects. She had spent the evening being precisely who she was in a room designed to make her feel like less, and the effort of that, not the performance, but the genuine internal architecture required to remain fully yourself, under sustained social pressure, was the kind of effort that does not show in real time and lands all at once. Afterward, in the quiet of a car moving through a city at night, she was aware of a tiredness that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with completion. After several minutes, he said quietly, "You doing all right?" She kept her eyes on the window. "Yes," she said. He waited a moment. Then, "Do you feel better?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I don't know that better is the word," she said. "I feel finished. That's different." Marcus nodded once and said nothing more. By morning, the financial news was circulating in the specific channels where such things circulate first, the morning briefings of risk officers and legal teams, and the kind of journalists who cover business scandals with the same detachment they would bring to earnings reports. The story of Ethan Walker's undisclosed liabilities was not yet public, but it was moving through the infrastructure that precedes public knowledge, and the people who had been in that ballroom the night before were already in quiet conversations with their lawyers and their advisors, each one privately recalculating what proximity to his name now cost them. Ethan Walker's development company would file for restructuring 6 weeks later. The headline would be dry and would not mention weddings or invitations or cream-colored cardstock. But the people who had been in the room would remember the order of events, and some of them would understand that the collapse had not begun when the first partner withdrew. It had been building for a long time, in the unseen architecture of choices made and prices not paid. Vanessa was at her desk by 7 in the morning, as she usually was. She had 3 client calls before noon, and a quarterly review scheduled for the afternoon, and her assistant had left a coffee on the corner of her desk with the quiet efficiency that characterized the entire operation of her life. She worked for 2 hours without stopping, reviewing contracts, answering a message from Raymond Holt about a referral he wanted to send, signing off on a staffing expansion in the satellite office. At some point during the morning, between one call and the next, she reached into the top drawer of her desk and withdrew the small velvet box. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she stood, took her jacket from the hook on the wall, and told her assistant she was going for a short walk. The river was 4 blocks from her building, and in the early morning it caught the light in the way of things that are entirely indifferent to being observed. She stood at the railing for a moment, looking at the water. Then she opened the box, and she took the ring between her fingers, and she felt its weight one last time, the weight of a promise made in good faith, of years spent in devotion to something that had not been what she believed it was, of a self she had not fully inhabited yet because she was too busy maintaining something else. She held it over the railing, and then, without ceremony, without a final glance, she let it go. It caught the light once as it fell, a single hard flash, and then it was gone. She stood at the railing for another moment, watching the place where it had entered the water. The river moved on without comment, which was appropriate, because some things do not require witness to be real. A jogger passed on the path behind her, earbuds in, entirely indifferent to the small private ceremony she had just conducted. A bird crossed the water low and fast and disappeared into the reeds on the far bank. The city was going about itself in the early morning way that cities have without drama, without acknowledgement, with the indifferent momentum of something too large to pause for individual reckoning. She felt, standing there, neither triumphant nor sad, but something that had no clean name in English. The feeling of having laid something down that you have carried for so long you forgot you were carrying it, and discovering, in the moment of setting it down, that your hands are lighter than you remembered they could be. She turned and walked back toward her building, and the morning opened ahead of her, clean and without encumbrance, and she walked into it with the particular sureness of someone who knows exactly who she is and has recently had the opportunity to confirm it. There is a common and durable myth about betrayal that the person who is wronged must carry it, must be marked by it, must in some way bear the evidence of having been discarded into the remainder of their life. It is a comfortable myth for those who do the discarding, because it makes the discarding feel final and complete, a verdict delivered that cannot be appealed. What Ethan Walker had failed to understand, what men like him almost always fail to understand, because understanding it would require a quality of imagination they have never been required to develop, is that what he had thrown away was not diminished by being thrown. It had landed. It had taken root. It had built something he could not have imagined when he sealed that invitation with his small, deliberate smile, something that would long outlast the evening he had designed for her humiliation. Vanessa Brooks had not come to his wedding to prove anything. She had come to close a door. She had closed it, and she had walked away into a life that needed nothing from him. Not acknowledgement, not apology, not even in the end, the satisfaction of his regret. She had needed only to stand in the room, whole and intact, and let the truth do what it had always been prepared to do, which was simply to be visible. The rest had taken care of itself. The people who betray us most thoroughly are rarely the ones who shout. They are the ones who smile. They are the ones who dress our diminishment in the language of inevitability, who reframe their cruelty as our limitation, who invite us to witness their success, not because they are confident, but because they are not, because somewhere beneath the custom suits and the conspicuous watches and the curated rooms full of people paid to reflect their value, back to them, there is a terror of insignificance that no amount of performance can quiet. Ethan Walker had spent 2 years trying to prove to himself, through the accumulated evidence of status and possessions and a younger woman on his arm, that the life he had chosen was worth the price he had paid for it. The price he had paid was Vanessa. And Vanessa, it turned out, had not gone down in value after all. The wedding flowers were discarded the following morning. The hotel staff cleared the ballroom with the methodical efficiency of people who have witnessed many kinds of evenings and have learned to treat them all the same. By noon, the room was reset, prepared for another occasion, holding no trace of what it had contained the night before. Some rooms are like that. Some people are not. The loyalty we are careless with, the devotion we fail to recognize, until the evidence of it walks into a room wearing black and surrounded by people whose entire purpose is her protection. These things do not disappear because we stopped valuing them. They simply find a better home. And in the finding, they become precisely what they always were, not the footnote of someone else's story, but the headline of their own.